The winter of 1943 descended upon Warsaw like a heavy blanket, soaked in ice water. The cobblestone streets, once bustling with merchants hawking fresh bread and children laughing as they chased pigeons to the old town square, now lay silent except for the rhythmic march of boots. German boots, the kind that echoed off the crumbling brick facades of buildings that had stood for centuries, buildings that now bore the scars of occupation. Smoke curled from chimneys, not from warmth and comfort, but from the desperate burning of furniture, books, anything to keep the cold at bay when coal became a luxury reserved for the occupiers. In this frozen hell, where the Vistula River ran dark and forbidding beneath bridges guarded by soldiers with rifles slung across their shoulders, there lived a woman named Helena Nowak. She was 32 years old, though the war had aged her in ways that numbers could not capture. Her hands, once soft from working as a schoolteacher, were now calloused and cracked from the harsh soap she used to scrub floors in a hospital where she volunteered. Her dark hair, which she kept pinned back in a practical bun, had begun to show threads of silver at her temples. But it was her eyes that told the real story. Deep brown eyes that had witnessed things no human should ever see, yet somehow still held a flicker of defiance, of hope, of something the Nazis could never quite extinguish. Helena lived in a narrow apartment on Zelazny Street, in a building that leaned slightly to the left as if exhausted by the weight of history. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' conversations, their arguments, their prayers whispered in the dark. 3 families shared a single bathroom at the end of the hall, and in winter, the pipes froze more often than not. Her apartment consisted of one room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table scarred by decades of use, 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a mattress that had lost its softness years ago, and a wardrobe that barely closed because the door hung crooked on its hinges. A single window looked out onto the street below, and she kept it covered with heavy fabric, because light after curfew could mean death. The occupation had transformed Warsaw into a city of whispers and shadows. The Jewish ghetto, established in 1940, had been sealed off by walls topped with broken glass and barbed wire. Over 400,000 people crammed into an area designed for a fraction of that number. Helena could smell the ghetto from her apartment when the wind blew from the north, a smell of unwashed bodies, disease, desperation, and death. The Nazis had made it clear. Jews were to be isolated, controlled, and eventually eliminated. By 1942, the deportations to Treblinka had begun. Trains packed with human cargo left the Umschlagplatz regularly, and everyone knew, though few dared speak aloud, that those trains carried people to their deaths. But Helena was not a woman who could simply look away. Before the war, she had taught literature and history at school in the Mokotów district. She had read to her students about heroes from Poland's past, about the uprisings and the struggles for independence, about courage in the face of tyranny. She had never imagined she would need to become one of those heroes herself. Yet here she was, involved with Zagoda, the underground organization dedicated to helping Jews escape the ghetto and find safety. It was dangerous work, terrifyingly dangerous. The penalty for helping Jews was execution, not just for the person caught, but often for their entire family, their neighbors, anyone the Nazis wanted to make an example of. Helena had already helped smuggle 12 children out of the ghetto over the past 8 months. 12 small lives saved through a network of brave souls who falsified documents, arranged hiding places in convents and orphanages, and risked everything for strangers. 12 children who might grow up to remember that not everyone had turned their backs when evil knocked on the door. The winter snow fell thick and relentless in early January 1943. Christmas had passed without celebration, New Year's without hope. The temperature plummeted to negative 15 degrees Celsius, and people huddled in their homes, burning whatever they could find for warmth. Food was scarce. The ration card provided by the occupation government were a cruel joke, offering barely enough to survive. The black market flourished, but prices were astronomical, and those caught trading could be shot on sight. On the evening of January 18th, as darkness settled over Warsaw like a predator claiming its territory, Elena received a message that would change everything. A knock came at her door, 3 soft taps followed by 2 harder ones. The signal. She opened it to find Tomasz, a thin man in his 50s who worked as a janitor at the courthouse. His face was pale, his breath coming in short gasps as if he had been running. "They're planning a major action," he whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. "Tomorrow night, the orphanage on Siena Street. They're going to liquidate it. All of them." Helena's heart clenched. She knew the orphanage. It housed 54 children, ranging from infants to teenagers. Jewish children whose parents had been taken or killed. Children who had been hidden there by desperate families hoping to save them from the deportations. The orphanage was run by a brave woman named Sister Maria, a Catholic nun who had falsified records to make it appear that the children were Catholic orphans displaced by the war. For months, it had worked. But somehow, someone had talked, or someone had discovered the truth. Now, if you're feeling the weight of this moment, if your heart is already beating faster wondering what happened to those 54 children, then you understand why these stories matter. The subscribe button isn't just a click. It's a promise that we'll keep telling these stories together, that we'll remember the hero's history almost forgot. But let me continue because Helena's night is just beginning, and what she does next will test every ounce of courage she possesses. 54, Helena repeated, the number hanging in the cold air between them. All of them. Tomasz nodded grimly. The trucks will come at dawn. You know what that means. She did know. Dawn raids were the Nazis' preferred method. Hit fast before anyone could organize resistance or warning. By the time the sun fully rose, those children would be packed into trains headed for Treblinka, where the gas chambers waited. 54 lives snuffed out as easily as blowing out candles. We have one night, Helena said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. One night to move 54 children. Tomasz looked at her as if she had lost her mind. Helena, that's impossible. We've never moved more than 2 or 3 at once. We don't have the papers, the hiding places, the transport, and with that many children, the chaos, the noise, we'd be caught before we got half of them out. But Helena was already moving, pulling her threadbare coat from the hook by the door, wrapping a scarf around her neck. Then we'd better start now. Go to Father Kowalski at St. Alexander's Church. Tell him we need every safe house he can access tonight. Every convent, every sympathetic family. I don't care they have to hide children in closets and cellars. Get everyone from Zagoda who can help. And Tomasz, give me a truck. I don't care how, but we need a truck. He stared at her for a moment longer, then nodded and disappeared into the night. Helena stood in her doorway, looking out at the snow-covered street. The occupation had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was this. When you wait for the perfect moment, for the ideal conditions, for courage to feel comfortable, you wait forever. Action, even imperfect and terrifying action, was the only answer to evil. She locked her door and made her way through the darkened streets, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the German patrols that swept through the city at irregular intervals. The curfew was strictly enforced. Anyone caught outside after dark without proper authorization could be arrested, interrogated, shot. But Helena had forged papers declaring her a nurse, giving her permission to travel for medical emergencies. The papers had worked twice before. She prayed they would work tonight. The orphanage on Siena Street was a 3-story building of red brick that had once been a wealthy merchant's home. Now its windows were covered with blackout curtains, and its facade bore the weathering of neglect. Helena approached from the back, through an alley filled with frozen garbage and broken crates. She knocked on the kitchen door, using the agreed-upon signal. Sister Maria opened it, her round face creased with worry. She was in her 50s, a woman whose kindness had not been diminished by the horrors surrounding her. Helena, thank God. You've heard. I've heard. We're getting them out. Tonight. All of them. Sister Maria's eyes widened. All? But how? Where will they go? I don't know yet, Helena admitted, stepping inside the warm kitchen where a single candle flickered on the table. But leaving them here means certain death. At least out there, scattered across the city, some might survive. Most might survive. The nun crossed herself, lips moving in silent prayer. Then she straightened her shoulders. Tell me what you need. Over the next hour, Helena and Sister Maria worked with desperate efficiency. They woke the children as quietly as possible, explaining in whispers that they were going on a journey, that they needed to be very brave and very quiet. The children, who had already learned to fear sudden noises and unexpected visitors, understood without needing elaborate explanations. The older ones helped the younger ones dress in multiple layers of clothing. Every warm item they owned went onto those small bodies because there was no guarantee they would have proper shelter wherever they ended up. Helena looked at their faces in the dim candlelight. 54 children. The youngest was 18 months old, a little girl named Richella, who clung to a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. The oldest was 15, a boy named David whose eyes held the haunted look of someone who had already seen too much death. In between were children of every age, each with their own story of loss and survival. Sarah, who hadn't spoken since watching her mother dragged away by soldiers. Jacob and Joseph, twin brothers who refused to be separated. Miriam, who sang softly to herself when she was frightened. Each one a universe of potential, of dreams, of futures that deserved a chance to unfold. Around midnight, Tomasz returned with Miracle, a delivery truck used for transporting vegetables to German barracks. The driver, a man named Pyotr who had lost his own children to typhus the previous winter, had agreed to help. "If I'm going to die anyway," he had told Tomasz, "I might as well die doing something good." But one truck could not hold 54 children, not safely, not without raising immediate suspicion if stopped. So Helena divided them into groups. The first group, 20 children, would go in the truck to a convent in Praga, across the river. The second group would be walked in small clusters through the streets to various hiding places closer by. The third group would shelter temporarily in the basement of Father Kowalski's church until more permanent arrangements could be made. The logistics were a nightmare. They needed forged documents for each child, new identities, baptismal certificates declaring them Catholic. Helena had contacts who could produce these papers, but it took time they did not have. So she made a decision. Some would travel without papers. It was riskier, but the alternative was leaving them to die. At 1 a.m, the first group climbed into the back of the truck. Helena had lined the floor with blankets and burlap sacks to muffle any sound. "Not a word," she whispered to them. "Not a cough, not a sneeze, not a whisper. Pretend you're invisible. Can you do that?" 20 small heads nodded. 20 pairs of frightened eyes looked up at her with trust she felt unworthy of bearing. She pulled the canvas cover over the truck bed, plunging them into darkness. Then she climbed into the cab beside Pyotr. The drive through Warsaw at night was surreal. The streets were empty except for German patrols. The truck's headlights barely pierced the darkness, conserving fuel as required by occupation regulations. Every checkpoint they approached made Helena's heart hammer, so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. At the first checkpoint, a young German soldier waved them down. He couldn't have been more than 19, his face still soft with youth despite the harsh uniform. "Papers," he demanded in accented Polish. Pyotr handed over the documents declaring he was transporting potatoes to the barracks at Praga. The soldier glanced at them, then walked around to the back of the truck. Helena's blood turned to ice. If he pulled back that canvas, if even one child made a sound, they would all die right here on this frozen street. The soldier's hand reached for the canvas edge. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, came the sound of gunshots. 3 sharp cracks echoing off the buildings. The soldier's head snapped around, his hand dropping from the canvas. His superior officer barked orders in German, and suddenly the entire checkpoint was mobilizing, soldiers running toward the source of shots. "Go," the young soldier said distractedly, already turning away. "Go." Pyotr didn't need to be told twice. He drove forward carefully, not too fast, not drawing attention, while Helena exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. In the back, 20 children remained absolutely silent, as if they understood their lives depended on it. Because they did. They made it to the convent just as the church bells tolled 2 a.m. Mother Superior, a stern woman named Agnieszka, who had already hidden 11 Jewish children in her cellar, met them at a side entrance. 20, she breathed, seeing the children climb down from the truck. "Dear God in heaven, 20. Can you take them?" Helena asked urgently. "We'll make room," Mother Superior replied, already ushering the children inside. "But Helena, this is only temporary. The Gestapo inspected us 3 weeks ago. They could return at any time." "I know. I'll find permanent places. Just keep them safe until I do." As the last child disappeared into the convent, little Richella turned back and waved her stuffed rabbit at Helena. Such a small gesture, but it pierced Helena's heart like an arrow. She waved back, blinking away tears she couldn't afford to shed. Not yet. The truck returned to Siena Street, and the night's work continued. The second phase was even more dangerous. Walking children through the streets meant exposure, vulnerability. Helena organized them into groups of 3 or 4, spacing them out by 15-minute intervals. She enlisted the help of others from Zagota who had arrived. Katarzyna, a baker's wife who had lost her husband to the occupation. Stanislav, a former schoolteacher like Helena. And Ava, barely 18 years old but fierce as a wolf when it came protecting the innocent. Each group was given a destination and a story. If stopped, they were siblings going to their aunt's house, or cousins displaced by bombing, or any of a dozen carefully constructed lies that might, if luck was with them, hold up under casual questioning. The older children were instructed to carry the younger ones piggyback, if needed, to make it look natural, like family. Helena herself led the first of these walking groups. 3 children, David, the 15-year-old, and 2 younger girls, Anna and Zofia. They set out into frozen night, moving through alleys and side streets Helena had memorized during her months of underground work. The snow had stopped falling, but ice made the cobblestones treacherous. Zofia, who was only 7, slipped twice, and each time David caught her with the reflexes of someone who had learned to be alert every moment of every day. They were halfway to their destination, a sympathetic family who lived above a bookshop on Marszałkowska Street, when Helena heard the sound that made her blood run cold. The bark of German commands, the sound of boots running on stone, a patrol sweeping through the streets just 2 blocks away. "Run," Helena whispered urgently. "Run now." They ran, slipping and sliding on the ice, David practically carrying Zofia while Anna, 9 years old, kept pace with determination born of terror. Helena's lungs burned with the cold air. Her legs, weak from months of inadequate nutrition, screamed in protest. But she ran because stopping meant death for all of them. The patrol's shouts grew louder. They had been seen. Helena yanked the children into a narrow passageway between 2 buildings, a space barely wide enough for their bodies. They pressed against the wall, breath coming in ragged gasps that created clouds of vapor in the freezing air. She put her finger to her lips, her eyes pleading, "Silence, please, silence." The boots came closer, closer. The beam of a flashlight swept across the entrance to their hiding place, passing over but not quite catching them in its glare. A German voice called out something in his language. Another voice answered. Then, miracle of miracles, the footsteps continued past. The patrol moved on, hunting for whoever had been seen, not quite certain where their quarry had disappeared to. They waited in that frozen passageway for 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours. Helena counted to 600 in her head, forcing herself to be patient, to be sure. Only when the night returned to its oppressive quiet did she dare to move. "Come," she whispered, and they emerged from their hiding place like ghosts returning to the world of the living. They made it to the bookshop without further incident. The family there, the Zawadzkis, welcomed the children with open arms despite their obvious fear. "We have a hidden room," Mr. Zawadsky explained, a slight man with spectacles that made his eyes look enormous. "Behind a false wall in the basement. The Germans have searched twice and never found it. The children will be safe until you can arrange something more permanent." Helena nodded her thanks, too exhausted for words. Then she headed back into the night because there were still dozens more children waiting. The operation continued through the darkest hours of the night. Group after group, child after child, moved through the frozen streets of Warsaw, like secrets passing from hand to hand. Not all the transfers went smoothly. One group was stopped by a patrol, but Katarzyna, who was leading them, had the presence of mind to break down in tears and claim her husband had been killed in a factory accident, that she was taking her dead brother's children to relatives. The German soldiers, perhaps softened by her tears, or perhaps simply eager to get out cold, let them pass with a warning about curfew violations. Another group had to hide in a coal cellar for 2 hours when a Gestapo car prowled through their intended route. The children emerged covered in black dust, looking like small ghosts, but alive. Alive was what mattered. By 4 a.m, 47 children had been moved. 7 remained at the orphanage, waiting for the final transport. These were the youngest ones, including baby Richella, who had been brought back from the convent because it was decided she would be safer at a different location where a woman with nursing experience could care for her. Helena stood in the orphanage kitchen, swaying with exhaustion. Her feet ached, her throat was raw from the cold air, and her hands trembled from adrenaline and fear. Sister Maria pressed a cup of weak tea into her hands. "You've done the impossible," the nun said softly. "You've saved them." "Not yet," Helena replied. "We still have 7 more. And dawn is coming." Dawn, when the Nazi trucks would arrive expecting to find 54 children ready for deportation. When Sister Maria would face arrest, torture, execution for hiding Jews. When the entire operation would be exposed if even one detail went wrong. Tomasz returned with the truck one final time. He looked as exhausted as Helena felt, his face gray in the dim light. "This is the last run," he said. "Pyotr says the truck is nearly out of fuel, and he's pushing his luck as it is. Where are we taking them?" "St. Joseph's Church in Walla," Helena said. "Father Noicki has agreed to hide them in the crypt until we can get them false papers and permanent placement." They loaded the last 7 children into the truck. Baby Richella had fallen asleep, her tiny head resting on her stuffed rabbit. The others, exhausted beyond measure, climbed in silently. They had learned in one night what most people never learn in a lifetime: how to disappear, how to be silent, how to survive. Helena climbed into the truck bed with them this time. She wanted to be there if anything went wrong, to face whatever came alongside these children rather than from the safety of the cab. Sister Maria handed her a rosary through the canvas opening. "May God protect you all," the nun whispered. The truck lurched forward, and they began the final journey of this impossible night. But fate, it seemed, had one more test in store. They were 3 blocks from St. Joseph's Church when a German command car appeared from a side street, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The car's horn blared twice, the signal to stop. Pyotr had no choice but to comply. He pulled the truck to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. In the back, Helena gathered the children close, wrapping her arms around as many as she could reach. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "remember that you are loved. Remember that people tried. Remember that good exists even in the darkest places." A German officer approached the cab, his breath visible in the cold air. Helena could hear muffled voices, Pyotr's responses in broken German, the officer's increasingly suspicious questions. Then came the sound she had been dreading: footsteps walking toward the back of the truck. The canvas was ripped open. A flashlight beam swept across the truck bed, illuminating Helena and the 7 children huddled around her. For a moment, everything froze. The German officer, a man in his 40s with a hard face and cold eyes, stared at the scene before him. Helena stared back, her arms tightening protectively around the children. Then something extraordinary happened. The officer's flashlight beam fell on baby Richella, who had woken and was looking up at her with wide, confused eyes, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The officer stared at the baby for a long moment. Something flickered across his face, some emotion Helena couldn't quite identify. Pain, perhaps, or memory, or the ghost of humanity he thought he had left behind when he put on that uniform. "Where are you taking them?" he asked in Polish, his accent thick, but his words clear. Helena made a split-second decision. The truth, or at least part of it, to a church. They're orphans. Their parents were killed in the bombing last month. We're taking them to priests who will care for them. The officer looked at each child's face. Then he looked back at baby Richella, who chose that moment to smile at him, a toothless infant smile of pure innocence. His jaw tightened. His hand moved to his holster, and Helena's heart stopped beating. But instead of drawing his weapon, He let the canvas fall closed. He walked back to his command car. Helena heard him speak sharply in German to the other soldiers. Then the command car's engine revved and it drove away, disappearing into the darkness. Pyotr sat frozen in the cab for a full minute before he could make himself drive forward. When they finally reached St. Joseph's Church, Father Nowicki was waiting at a side entrance. The 7 children were hurried inside and down into the crypt, where blankets and food had been prepared. As the last child disappeared into safety, Helena collapsed against the church wall, her legs finally giving out. The night was over. Dawn was breaking over Warsaw, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale yellow. Somewhere in the city, Nazi trucks were arriving at the orphanage on Siena Street, to find it empty. Somewhere, an alarm was being raised. Somewhere, questions were being asked. But 54 children were alive, scattered across Warsaw in convents and churches, in hidden rooms and false-bottomed wardrobes, in cellars and attics. 54 children who should have died that day were breathing, their hearts beating, their future still possible. Over the following weeks, Helena worked tirelessly to create permanent identities and placements for each child. It was painstaking work that required forging documents, negotiating with sympathetic families, and moving children multiple times when hiding places became compromised. Not all 54 survived the war. 8 were discovered in later raids and killed. 3 died of disease in their hiding places. But 43 lived to see liberation in 1945. 43 children who grew up, who had families of their own, who told their children and grandchildren about the night a schoolteacher named Helena Nowak refused to accept that evil would win. Helena herself was arrested by the Gestapo in March 1944 after someone betrayed Zagoda's network. She was interrogated for 3 days, tortured for information about others in the organization. She gave them nothing, not a single name, not a single location. She was sentenced to death, but in the chaos of Warsaw's final days under occupation, she was transferred to a labor camp instead. She survived the camp, though barely, emerging at war's end weighing less than 90 pounds and bearing scars she would carry for the rest of her life. She never spoke much about what she had done. When asked years later how she had found the courage to attempt something so impossible, to try to save 54 children in a single night, she said simply, "There was no courage. There was only the choice between trying and not trying, between action and complicity. I could not live with myself if I had chosen to do nothing." But there was one more chapter to this story, one that Helena would not learn until decades after the war ended. Remember the German officer who had stopped their truck that final morning, who had looked at baby Richella and then let them pass. His name was Klaus Weber, and he had a daughter. She would have been 3 years old in 1943, if she had lived. But she had died of scarlet fever in 1941, and he carried her photograph in his uniform pocket every day of the war. When he saw baby Richella that frozen morning, he saw his daughter's face, and in that moment, the part of him that war had tried to kill fought its way to the surface one last time. He made a choice, just as Helena had made a choice. He could not save his own daughter, but perhaps he could save these children. Perhaps, in some small way, that could matter. Klaus Weber survived the war and returned to Germany. He never told anyone what he had done that morning in Warsaw. He carried the secret until his death in 1979, when his grandson found a journal hidden in his belongings. In it, Klaus had written, "I let them go. I let the children go. It does not erase what I failed to stop, what I was part of, but perhaps it means that even in hell, even when we become monsters, a single moment of humanity is possible. I pray it was enough." Little Richella, the baby with the stuffed rabbit, survived the war. She was adopted by a Polish family and grew up to become a doctor. She never knew her real parents' names, never knew the full story of the night she was saved, never knew about the German officer who chose mercy. But she spent her life saving others, working in hospitals across Poland, and she always kept a stuffed rabbit in her office. When patients asked about it, she would say it was a reminder that even the smallest among us are worth saving. David, the 15-year-old boy who helped carry Zofia to the frozen streets, survived as well. He emigrated to America after the war, changed his name to Daniel, and became a teacher. He taught history to high school students in Brooklyn, and every year he would tell them about the Holocaust, about Warsaw, about a night when ordinary people chose to be extraordinary. He never mentioned that he was one of the children saved that night. He let Helena's story be the one remembered. As for Helena, she lived until 1997, reaching the age of 86. She spent the post-war decades teaching again, returning to her first love of literature and history. She never married, never had children of her own. When asked about this, she would smile and say, "I had 54 children for one night. That was enough." In 1985, she was recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. She traveled to Jerusalem for the ceremony, where she planted a tree in the Garden of the Righteous. Several of the children she had saved attended the ceremony, now middle-aged men and women with children and grandchildren of their own. They tried to thank her, these survivors, try to find words adequate to express their gratitude for the gift of life she had given them. But Helena stopped them. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank the human spirit that refuses to surrender to darkness. Thank the part of each of us that knows, without being told, that a child's life matters more than our own safety. Thank the ordinary people who become heroes not because they sought glory, but because they could not live with themselves if they chose cowardice." The winter of 1943 in Warsaw was a season of unspeakable horror. Hundreds of thousands died in the ghetto, in the camps, in the streets. The city itself was later razed almost to the ground during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. So much was lost, so much darkness. But in that darkness, a schoolteacher and a handful of brave souls moved 54 children to safety in a single night. They did the impossible because the alternative was unthinkable. They risked everything because they understood a fundamental truth that evil always tries to make us forget, that every life has infinite value, that every child deserves a future, that we're defined not by the comfort of our choices, but by the courage we summon when comfort is impossible. The orphanage on Siena Street was destroyed in 1944, reduced to rubble like so much of Warsaw. The street exists today, rebuilt, modern, bustling with life. People walk past the location where the orphanage once stood without knowing the story of what happened there, without knowing about the children who should have died but lived, without knowing about Helena and her impossible night. But the story survives because stories of courage must survive. They are humanity's answer to darkness, proof that even when evil seems overwhelming, even when the odds are impossible, people can choose to stand against it, not with armies or weapons, but with simple acts of breathtaking bravery. A truck driver who could have said no, but said yes. A nun who could have turned away, but opened her doors. A baker's wife, a janitor, a former teacher, all choosing to risk everything for children who were not their own. And at the center of it all, a woman named Helena Nowak, who on one frozen January night in 1943, heard that 54 children were about to die and decided that was unacceptable, who organized the impossible, who moved through the darkness carrying hope in her heart and children in her wake, who faced down Nazi patrols in her own fear and the overwhelming odds against success. She was not a soldier or a spy or someone trained for heroism. She was a schoolteacher who believed that teaching literature and history meant something, that the stories of courage she had shared with her students needed to be lived as well as told. She was an ordinary woman who discovered that ordinary people, when confronted with extraordinary evil, are capable of extraordinary good. The dawn that broke over Warsaw on January 19th, 1943, found 54 children alive who should have been dead. It found Helena Nowak exhausted beyond measure, but standing, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the darkness. It found proof that even in humanity's darkest chapter, light persists. Not as a grand, sweeping force, but as 54 small flames, 54 beating hearts, 54 futures saved by people who decided that giving up was not an option. When we speak of the Holocaust, we must speak of the horror. We must bear witness to the 6 million killed, to the evil that was perpetrated, to the depths of cruelty humanity can reach. But we must also speak of people like Helena. We must remember that alongside the worst of humanity, there existed the best, That for every train that carried people to death camps, there were people trying to derail those trains, hiding passengers, creating false documents, risking everything to save strangers. These stories matter. They matter because they remind us that we all face choices every day about what kind of person we will be. The choices are rarely as dramatic as Helena's, but they are choices nonetheless. To speak up or stay silent, to help or look away, to risk something of ourselves for others or protect our own comfort. And the accumulation of these small choices determines who we are, what we stand for, whether our lives will have meaning beyond our own survival. Helena Nowak's night of impossible courage echoes down through the decades. The children she saved had children who had children. The ripples of her choice spread outward, creating lives and love and futures that would never have existed if she had chosen differently. Somewhere today, there are people walking the earth who owe their very existence to a woman who refused to accept that 54 children were beyond saving. This is what one person can do. This is what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. Not the certainty of success, but the refusal to surrender without trying. Not superhuman ability, but human decency pushed to its absolute limit, and then somehow finding just a little more. The stuffed rabbit that baby Richella carried that night still exists. It sits in a museum now, in the Holocaust section, behind glass. One ear missing, for worn thin by small hands that clutched it through terror and cold and an impossible journey to safety. Next to it is a photograph of Helena, taken in the 1960s. She is smiling, her face lined with age, but her eyes still bright with that indomitable spirit that would not let darkness win. Visitors to the museum often pause at this exhibit. They read the story, they look at the rabbit and the photograph, and they ask themselves the question we must all ask. What would I have done? Would I have had the courage? Would I have risked everything for children I didn't know? Would I have been Helena? Or would I have been one of the many who looked away, who told themselves there was nothing they could do, who chose survival over sacrifice? We cannot know how we would answer until we are tested. But we can prepare ourselves for that test by remembering stories like this one, by honoring the memory of people who showed us what is possible when compassion becomes stronger than fear, by teaching our children that heroes are not born but made, forged in moments of crisis, when ordinary people decide that some things matter more than safety. Helena Nowak saved 54 children in one impossible night. She could not save everyone. She could not stop the war or defeat the Nazi machine or prevent the deaths of millions. But she saved 54. And 54 lives saved is 54 universes preserved, 54 futures given a chance to unfold, 54 testaments to the fact that goodness persists even when evil seems invincible. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that we cannot always win, that we cannot always save everyone, but we can always try. We can always choose to stand on the side of life rather than death, of hope rather than despair, of action rather than complicity. We can be the person who, when faced with impossible odds and overwhelming darkness, says simply, I will not accept this. I will not let this stand. I will do what I can, even if what I can do seems too small to matter. Because it matters. It always matters. Every life saved is a victory against the forces of destruction. Every act of courage is a blow against tyranny. Every person who chooses compassion over comfort is a light in the darkness. Enough lights, no matter how small, can illuminate even the longest night. Helena Nowak understood this. On a frozen evening in January 1943, she heard that 54 children were going to die, and she said no. Not on my watch. Not if I can help it. Not without a fight. And in saying no, in organizing the impossible, in moving to the darkness with purpose and determination and an unshakable belief that those children's lives mattered, she became what we all can become if we choose, a person whose life stood for something more than mere survival, whose actions rippled outward into eternity, whose courage reminds us that we are capable of more than we know. The night ends, dawn comes, and 54 children live to see it. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is a choice we all must make in our own ways, in our own moments of crisis. To be the person who tries, who acts, who refuses to let darkness have the final word. Helena Nowak showed us the way. The question now, as it has always been, is whether we have the courage to follow,